With 15 million scripts and about 100 million individual answers, 30,000 markers, the assessment process is a huge industry. But it's not just a tremendous industry, it's actually vitally important to the education of our students. And as we make exams more rigorous, stretching the most able, and preparing students for the workplace, the assessment process plays a critical role in the education of our children. It's not only exam outcomes which the assessment process dictates, i.e. the marks at the end of the process, but I think the exam process and the exam assessment plays a critical role in determining what subjects, how subjects are taught, what's part of the curriculum, and the whole process of education. So I think it's extremely important that we're all here today to discuss how we improve those processes to bring the best outcomes for our students. First up today is Simon Lebus. He's the Group Chief Executive of Cambridge Assessment and also Chairman of OCR Exam Board. He's a Bi-Fellow of Emmanuel College, and he's going to talk to us today on the use of evidence to improve assessments and restore public confidence in England's exam system. So Simon, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and timely. The agenda talks about next steps for reform, but actually we're right bang in the middle of a reform process. It's very timely to be having this seminar now, because we've just embarked on the first teaching of new A-levels and GCSEs, and as many of you may recall, they were described in the House of Commons, I think in June 2013, by Michael Gove as the most radical reform of the exam system for 30 years. I've been doing this job for about 15 years now, so I sort of see probably about 2 or 3 ways of radical reform. And my observation is that the introduction of new qualifications is always a period of maximum risk for the public exam system. And in this case, we're going to be living through that right through till 1919, which is when the final tranche of the new qualifications is due to be sat for the first time. So it's a really good moment for a bit of horizon scanning. Looking at that horizon, there are probably a couple of points I particularly want to focus on. I don't know whether you could call it a classification system, but using the Rumsfeld classification system, they both, I suggest, come into the category of known unknowns. They're not unknown unknowns, but they're known unknowns, and as such still pretty challenging. And the first of that is the question of whether GCSEs are part. We call for them to be phased out as part of a programme of curriculum reform spanning both academic and vocational subjects. And Tony Little, the former headmaster of Eton, has suggested, but he's not unique in this, lots of others have done, so that the need for GCSEs in fact no longer exists because of the increase in the age for compulsory education to 18. So we are opposed in having an exam like GCSE at 16, and we commissioned some research from our research division to look at the education system in about 53 different countries, and we put the results of that out in the pack that you would have got when you arrived. Of those 53 countries, just over half, in fact, around 27, carry out some form of external assessment at the gateway to upper secondary education. And we also were interested in the question, is that how spread was that? What's actually happening in the high-performing jurisdictions, which everybody talks about? So we drilled down to look at those. And it's quite difficult, in fact, coming up with an agreement as to what constitutes a high-performing jurisdiction. But the methodology we used was that these were countries that appeared in at least 6 out of 7 in the top 20 position in various international studies such as PIMS and TIMS and PEARLS and so on. And we found much the same picture here with 4 out of the 7 high-performing jurisdictions that we were able to identify carrying out external assessments. 1 carrying out formal teacher assessment, and only 2 not having any assessments at this level. So what this evidence shows, I think fairly conclusively, is that having an external assessment like GCSE at the gateway through to upper secondary is not remotely oddball, contrary to the contention of John Pridlin. And I think that's also reflected in our own experience with IGCSEs, or in some case O-levels, which Cambridge Assessment offers through Cambridge International Examinations, which is part of the Cambridge Assessment Group. And those are taken in 160 different countries around the world. Is it surprising, in fact? I think probably not. The progression to upper secondary is an absolutely critical juncture in young people's lives. exams taken at the end of lower secondary, in fact, have a really useful purpose in certifying that young people have a sound general education before they start to specialise. And they also provide one of the most effective mechanisms for providing clear signals about how the lower secondary curriculum should be organised and what young people who are schooled in it are expected to learn. I think another factor, and we're going to be talking a bit about some of the impact of digital education, is that as learning activities are transformed by the impact of digital, become somewhat more amorphous, and learning strategies become more variable because of the impact of digital and new technology and different approaches to learning and pedagogy. There's never greater need to determine with precision the learning that has taken place before progression. So that's about making sure that we can really identify correctly the learning that's taken place before people go on to specialise. And I also actually think in terms of the concept of oddballs, the move is towards more external examination. I think one of the things that one can observe over the last few years is that the increasing pressure and hyper-accountability on school systems are pushing things in the direction of more external assessment as people become more suspicious of teacher assessment because teacher assessment gets so distorted by the pressures of hyper-accountability. So that debate about whether we will still need GCSEs, I think is really, in reality, a proxy debate about the sort of curriculum we need and the sort of learning that we want for our young people in a period of change. And there are many well-rehearsed strands to this, which I think you'll all be familiar with, the balance between applied and academic skills, between content knowledge and soft skills, what levels of academic and mathematical literacy are needed for young people to function in our global, multicultural and technologically dependent society, and so on. They're all themes that are well-rehearsed. And they're complex issues that will continue to be the subject of debate. And I think my contention would be that you'd have to be really certain that abolishing GCSEs was the answer before embarking on what would otherwise be a very significant upheaval without a high degree of consensus as to how you wanted to replace it. And I think even if you did end up replacing GCSEs, you would not get rid of external exams at the age of 16 or the gateway from lower to upper secondary, whatever happened. That's GCSEs, and that brings me then on to my second known unknown, which is the question of whether the public exam system is best served by having multiple exam boards. There, I think the concept of England as an oddball nation probably is a bit more accurate. We are unusual in having multiple exam boards, and it's probably not the sort of place you started. You were starting from scratch. But we're not starting from scratch. Now, earlier in the summer, in August, the Daily Mail, not normally a Journal of Educational Record, reported a conversation it had in August with Schools Minister Nick Gibb. And the headline for that was "Dumbed-down exam boards facing acts in huge GCSE shake-up. Government threatens to tear up the exam amid growing anger over standard." And it reported that officials have been commissioned to look at structural reform. The preferred option being identified apparently as a single state-owned and run exam boards. On the singular, on the grounds that that would be a more effective means of securing standards and guarding against grade inflation and would prevent a drift towards easier questions. Now, it's not the first time that the question has been asked, and interesting, the current 3 exam boards, the current setup we have in England is itself the result of a government-driven wave of consolidation that took place in the 1990s, and before that took place, before the current 3 boards were set up, there were around depending how you classify with CSE boards, O-level and A-level boards and so on. There are around 40 different CSE boards, around 40 different boards. So there's a big wave of consolidation that took place in the 1990s, prompted by the government. And the philosophy behind that was to create unitary exam boards that would offer both academic and vocational qualifications. The philosophy behind that being that that might somehow lead to parity of esteem between both types of qualifications. Well, it didn't. And the exercise again bore all the hallmarks of exam board reform being used as a proxy to pursue another agenda. So the question arises, what might that agenda be this time round? The new regulatory regime introduced by Ofqual under Glenys's leadership, and she'll be talking here later, has been effective, I think, in stopping grade inflation. So on the face of it, I suspect the desire on the part of government is more likely to be about getting more actively involved in determining content and content standards, how much knowledge should people have, how much knowledge should be tested as part of these exams. And the question we have to ask ourselves is that a good thing? And also, actually, what is going to be achieved that's not been done already? The Department for Education is, in fact, already responsible for determining subject content. So it's not clear in that context what extra benefits setting up a single state-run exam board would bring. And in the meantime, there will be a need to manage a host of other problems that will be associated with such a migration. In particular, I think the technology and operational resource required to manage the exam system is significant, and I'm not sure it's always appreciated quite how complex and elaborate that is. OCR, which is part of the Cambridge Assessment Group, produces around 600 different general qualifications papers each year, which will rise in fact to 1,000 in 2017 when we run both the new and the old qualifications in parallel. And those in about 60 different subjects. We receive well over 1 million candidate entries, all of whose papers are scanned for marking, and colleagues from RM who are sponsoring this conference will be talking, but that's about 104 million images. And then they're distributed to around 16,000 examiners who mark them during a very intense period of activity running throughout June, July and much of August, an anxious time for me, and I'm sure many of the rest of you in this room. So at peak times, our computer systems can be processing as many as 7 million marks an hour. Now, to try and get an idea of what the scale of the system therefore is in its totality, OCR has about a 25 market share. So if you multiply those numbers up by 4, you get a sense of the scale at which a single state-run exam board and its supporting technology infrastructure would need to operate. And of course, the experience of government running large, time-sensitive technology projects has been pretty variable over the years. I think you think, for example, of some of the problems that HMRC ran into when the Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise were merged. And there's no particular reason that I can think of why you would expect this exercise to run any more smoothly. And indeed, I would say it sounds like a rather improbably Corbinesque solution for a Conservative government to want to implement. And it would also have, I think, the further rather interesting Corbinesque consequence of providing a single point for entryism, which was a sort of great thing in the 80s for Corbyn and various of his colleagues, by educational progressives, or indeed Tory ministers, with an eye to system capture. It would provide a single point that it would be very easy for people to get involved in and capture, where they were driven by political rather than educational motives. I don't think either that this would do anything to tackle the problem identified last week by the chairman of the HMC at their conference, when he commented on the exam system and stated, "The current situation is untenable. We're facing a perfect storm of both decreasing public confidence and increasing pressure in the system, as the ever greater emphasis on end-of-year exam results creates even more work for examiners in the summer." And so the question is whether that decreasing confidence, which I think is palpable, it's very easy to observe, you see it in the newspapers and so on, hear it in conversation and discussion, is it remediable? And if so, what might he and the other stakeholders involved help to do to restore it? Now, I think a very major factor in all of this is issues to do with quality of marking, which I think Dennis will talk about later. As I mentioned, the exam system relies on the support each year of around, not 30,000 markers that Lucy said, but 50,000 markers in fact, mainly current or retired teachers who very often have to fit their marking in around professional and other commitments, and it falls to them to mark several million scripts from around 1.5 million candidates in that intense and highly time-constrained 3-month window I was talking about. So the pressure's intense, there's not much room for slippage, and the system is very dependent, among other things, on their commitment, the markers, the examiner's commitment, their professionalism and their goodwill. And the period ahead of us, when we have a few years of new qualifications running in parallel with old, means that we're likely in the near term to have a very significant increase in terms of the numbers of markers that we need. Our estimates, our modelling suggests that's likely to be around 20% in 17, 20% more markers. So I very much hope that HMC and other school leadership groups will give a lead in this area, make space for and encourage their teachers to become markers. And I think also that other stakeholders will recognise that this is a problem that needs a strategic solution, that needs really strategic thinking. I think that's something that would also be desirable for the health of the exam system. Becoming involved in marking provides an excellent source of professional development, and it's a superb way to get to understand the relationship between the syllabus and what is being examined, and to internalise the standards. So it's another very good way of getting to grips with grade inflation. Also, I think eventually creating an environment where the exam boards can be slightly more permissive of professional judgment, where we can have slightly more open-ended mark schemes and so on. So I think there's some real positive benefits to be had, quite aside from meeting the logistic challenge that 2017 represents. I think also it promotes ownership of the outcomes, and that is something that's important in terms of promoting overall levels of confidence in the system and moving us away from what otherwise often seems like a very adversarial dialogue. We're constantly in a position where people are challenging exam results because they're responding to pressure from high accountability. They're responding to pressure from parents back because of the mistakes. The mistakes do happen, but if it's done in a very aggressive way, it's not helpful. We get into a sort of adversarial situation. The irony, of course, is that the markers we use are very often teaching in the schools that are challenging the marks. So there's got to be a much better and more constructive dialogue about that if we're to meet the challenges of implementing this reform programme effectively. So, in conclusion, I think we do have a busy few years ahead of us, and it's going to be challenging enough to deliver the reform programme as it stands. So my sense would be we'd be better off bedding those changes in while we have a discussion about some of these macro issues, but recognising that if we are going to make some of these fundamental changes, we need to avoid the next 5 years, because otherwise we will end up, I think, jeopardising the stability of the system in a period of maximum change. Thank you.